reading as part of writing. So if I feel like I'm just not getting anywhere with a draft, like I'll allow myself that time to read, and it counts to me as writing because I think it just changes the way that we're thinking about language and it resets our minds.
Well, hello. Thank you for tuning in to the Shifting Schools podcast. My name is Tricia Friedman, and this week we're doing something that's just a touch different. I'm actually going to bring you a conversation that I originally recorded for my other podcast. That's the Be a Better Ally podcast. If you like this week's discussion, you might want to follow that show as well. Now, this episode is timely. You might be aware that this is the launch of Women's History Month, and that's why I'm super excited to bring you special guest Rio Cortez, who is the author. She's also a New York Times best-selling author, and her latest picture book project is entitled The ABCs of Women's History. I absolutely fell in love with this book, even though it's a picture book whose audience is, of course, young readers. There's a lot that we can do with it as adult readers as well. Rio and I get into that in the show, and I want to let you know that if you really like this conversation and you're thinking, I'd love a copy of that book, you do have a special opportunity to win a free copy. At Shifting Schools, we really, really appreciate our listeners. And so if you leave us a show rating and review on Apple or Spotify podcasts, grab a screenshot, flick over an email to me, and you will instantly be entered to win a free copy of the book. Now, I also want to let you know that if you'd like to learn with Jeff and I, a special opportunity to do so is coming up April 17th. We're looking at how AI literacy is interwoven with other literacies. And right now, Shifting Schools, podcast listeners, newsletter subscribers, you can get access to all 3 webinars we're hosting on April 17th for the price of 1. Now, if you sign up again this week, you get not only the 3-for-1 deal, but because you're doing us that great thing that we love and tuning into the show right now, I want to remind you listeners, you have a special promo code. When you sign up to join us April 17th, all you need to add is promo code, it's all caps, SSPOD25, and you get an additional $25 savings. So we hope to see you April 17th. Again, you can learn all about the 3 very special webinars that we are hosting that day. We hope to see you there. Now, let's dig into our incredible conversation with Rio Cortez. And again, if you like the conversation, every Thursday, Be a Better Ally podcast has a brand new episode. Thanks again, folks, for tuning in. Welcome to the show, Rio Cortez. Rio, thank you so much for being here today to talk about your latest work, The ABCs of Women's History. I kind of want to start actually at the end of the book. Not that I have a favorite letter, but I really loved what you did with Z. Z is for zeal. And the book really
Thank
has
you.
me thinking like zeal is a good word. And to quote you back in Z, you talk about that all of the figures in the book are part of a, quote, infinite, beautiful chorus. Let's talk more about that chorus because we have figures from all different professions. Can you say more about why you wanted to draw from so many different fields?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you. Z is very hard if you're reading an abecedarian book of any kind. I'll just say Z and X are very challenging letters. So I appreciate that. I think I approached the whole alphabet of history here through, in a lot of ways, through interdisciplinary organization, if you will. I was thinking a lot about disciplines as I created the alphabet structure. So I was thinking, it's women's history is an enormous, almost impenetrable subject to narrow down for young readers. For me, it felt overwhelming because there's so much there and the parameters are so blurry, like where does it begin? Where does women's history start and end? where are we looking in the world? Are we looking at a global history? Are we looking here in America, in North America? And so I think in order for my brain to just like begin to think about it, I was thinking about, oh, let's talk about visual artists or writers or people who made policy around things like Title IX or paid family leave, or musicians or whatever it is, environmental activists, people in the community organizing space. And I think once I started to think about that, I was able to like put together sort of a conversation about women's history that made sense and that was like, approachable as I wrote the book. So, yeah, I think you nailed it, that it's very interdisciplinary because that's the way I started to conceive of the organization from the very beginning.
I love that because I think for young readers, for not so young readers as well, it really does get you thinking about how across those fields there's influence, there's power. Like, not to go out on too far of a tangent, but I've been doing more of a deep dive into monster studies. Yeah,
Ooh,
it's like very interesting, and it just has me thinking about if you go back through history and you look at like what a popular monster or popular horror film was at a given era, it'll tell you
yeah.
something about the society's
Mm,
fears around that time.
mm,
So I think anything that pushes readers to be looking for connections is
yeah.
really critical. And I should say also this book, as the other part of the series, it was a collaboration. And I wonder how, in seeking to make those connections, was it an asset that you are collaborating with an illustrator and an illustrator you've worked with before?
Yeah, it was. Thanks for mentioning that. So how it worked for us, the way that we've worked together, Lauren and I, Lauren, who's the illustrator, I created the text, the whole verse, and then she gets an early draft and we'll start thinking about how she wants to illustrate it. But then it becomes more collaborative like later on because it'll be that maybe Lauren is illustrating a person who doesn't appear in the verse that I really wanted to get into the verse. So I'll say like this because it's a rhyming poem. So I'll be like, on this letter, if for labor, I really wanted to include this name, Lauren, but I just couldn't get it in. And then Lauren would maybe find a way to incorporate them through her art. And so it was a way to include more people, the way that we work together, and expand it. And in some cases, like I did for the letter R, we did R's for Riot Girls, which was like a personal passion. And in it, like Lauren put band names on the t-shirts in the audience of that page without like, she just did that. So some of it is just also, I think, who's important to her or the spines of the books. There's a letter for Kay that there's a lot of teachers and librarians. And then in the bookshelf behind them, they're all women writers who have had a role in children's literature. So Lauren came up with a lot of the names on the spines of those books. And so yeah, it was very collaborative. I think as we could wanted to pack it with as many important women as possible. So the art really helped to serve that purpose.
Rio, that's where I think sometimes when we talk about a book like this, or I know you've got a lot of events coming up and it will be in the children's lit section. I kind of think that art of reading a book like this is so good for adult readers because you have to slow down to appreciate the
Yeah,
details. You have to
yeah,
look again.
yeah.
Can you maybe say more about your feelings of the world, the genre, and why maybe, especially right now, where we talk about our attention being fragmented? I just feel like it's
Yeah,
an art that's good for the older folks.
I agree. I think that's why, like, I mean, sort of cutely, children's publishers will say, like, from ages 5 to 99, but I think it's also kind of true, especially for picture books, because picture books are not only created collaboratively often, I mean, sometimes they're written and illustrated by one person, but they're often collaboratively created and they're actually designed to be shared in collaboration in a way. Like you're thinking of a reader and a listener, whether that reader is a teacher and a student or a caregiver and a child. It's often two readers and two makers at least. And so yeah, it's a really special genre of book. I feel like the picture book genre for that reason. But yeah, for like my parents' neighbors read the ABCs of Black History, which we did, and they would read a letter a day, just two grown women, and they would just dive a little deeper into the figures that they didn't know and kind of create a little curriculum for themselves. I was so inspired by that gesture because it's like you're saying, it's like it was just an effort to kind of grow their understanding of a subject in a really slow way. Like, I don't know, yeah. There's a what is it like fast, slow food and slow clothes. Like
Mm.
every, it's like a nice method. Like nice for our brains to slow down that way and digest things. I think you're right.
A slow reading method.
Yeah,
I really love that. And you mentioned your earlier work. This book is a part of that series that's helping readers, again, of all ages, really think about we need to know our history and we almost need to preemptively understand that some of the history we need to know the most is not the stuff that's been in traditional textbooks.
yeah,
I'm wondering for you personally how working on the series has helped you understand, if you have a good history education, it will serve you personally. Do you have any thoughts on that?
yeah. I do. I mean, I think having context for where we are is helpful all the time. I mean, like our circumstances are completely built by time, you know. It's like never in a vacuum. And so I think it's always really helpful to think about exactly what's happening in front of you and what's happening perhaps in the future. I think one of the best ways to do that is by looking in the past. And so history has like served that purpose for me in my personal life all the time, but also just taking inspiration. I mean, the way that writers, I feel like, write better when they're reading, it's like the same thing, except there are all these disciplines that you could apply that to, just like we're talking about. So, whatever work you're doing or you're interested in or inspired by, I think knowing its flag bearers is only going to enhance whatever your endeavor is in that way. I don't know if that makes
Yeah,
sense.
totally. And I'm kind of curious, and it's a little bit of a personal question, so feel free to just be like, pass. But I'm always so curious about other people's reading habits, both like content, but also, you mentioned that great activity that your parents' neighbors were doing, like one letter a day, which I
Yeah.
love that, intentionally just slow down your consumption of something.
Mhm.
Could you talk a little bit about like what's on your to be read or, the year ahead, like, or just even like how you like, sometimes people ask me every year I set out to read 100 books and people are like, how do you do
Oh.
that? I'm like, A, it's commentary on my social life. But B, like, my wife and I go to bed early. Like, we're in bed
Yeah.
early and that's my reading time, which, not everybody
Yes.
can do. Like, that's like a little bit of a privileged comment. But I'm kind of just curious, like, you know, you commented on writers need to have good reader
Yeah.
lives. What's your reader live like?
Yeah. Oh gosh. I feel like constantly overwhelmed by how much I want to read and I'm not reading. But I think one thing I always go to is poetry. I mean, I have a background in poetry, and something that does never overwhelms me is the idea of reading a poem. So if you're interested in that kind of slow reading, like even if you don't have the beauty and time, like you can say, I'm going to read a poem before bed. I do that a lot. Like I'll put a poetry collection by my bed and a novel usually. I want to read the novel and but I sometimes just don't have the energy to read anything but a poem. And I feel like it's a really good way to begin or end a day, or often short stories, essays, like short form things that I know I can get through. But my favorite thing to read is actually novels. So right now I'm reading a little bit of all that, and then I have a 6-year old, and so I'm also reading whatever she wants to read at night, which is kind of fun. And that's usually picture books, but she's getting really into chapter books now too. And she's reading to me a little bit, which is also kind of new. So I feel like through that I'm reading poetry, a little bit of a novel as I get through, and then a little bit of picture book every day. I don't have specifics right now, but also when I'm writing and I have a block, I always tell myself that reading is part of writing. So if I feel like just not getting anywhere with a draft, like I'll allow myself that time to read, and it counts to me as writing because I think it just changes the way that we're thinking about language and it resets our minds. And yeah, so and introduces new ideas that can help generate creative work, you know?
Oh, I love that, to think of reading as also writing time. I think a lot of writing teachers who are listening to this, like, that's a really great thing to share with students. Um,
Yeah.
Listeners who are like, really into the New Yorker might be thinking that voice sounds familiar, and they might recognize it. You've had work published in the New Yorker from your debut poetry collection, and it's also read by you. So I'll link to that in the show notes.
Oh, great.
Super curious, when you're working on poetry for adult readers versus this book is children's book in verse. It's not completely different, but also it very much is.
Yeah.
Where does your process merge and where does it diverge when you're working for different audiences like that?
Yeah. I feel like they're completely different parts of my, I mean, I think of them both as poetry. The writing I do for children and adults, it's all poetry to me. Um, but writing for children is a really joyful, pleasurable practice. Not that writing for poetry for adults isn't. I think it comes when it comes, is kind of how I feel. Like there's this great, I'll never get it. I'm constantly butchering this story, but it's like a Ruth Stone story that Liz Gilbert told about how like like a poem is like a horse running towards you and you try to grab its reins and so what so much more beautiful when she tells it. But I think of writing for adults like that, like sometimes the thought will come to me and I'll write it right then. But when I sit down and I write for children, I'm like being intentional. I'm thinking about like, I have this idea I want to work through and I'll create drafts and the language, you want it to be friendly and inviting for children, but also full of like truth telling. That's like kind of my secret sauce, I feel like. So it's just different, like, as opposed to, I'm not explaining it very well, but I would just say that they're radically different and it's much more fun to write for kids than for adults, although equally gratifying is what I would, how I would summarize it all.
Well,
Yeah.
and I'm wondering too how with both audiences, I feel like when I'm reading your work, there's an element with both audiences where you have to trust the reader. I
Yeah.
think about sometimes like my parents really love like British police procedurals, and we talk a lot about how that as a genre will trust their audience to like understand what's happening in the plot versus I think a lot of American ones are like, "Did you just see
Yes.
what happened? Let's say it 3 times to make sure everybody understands."
Totally, totally.
Um,
Yeah, yeah.
how has that shifted for you? You mentioned having a young child. I'm wondering if that has given you more perspective in terms of, yeah, there's intelligence there. Like, I can trust the reader to do the thinking.
Ugh, I love that you said that because I think poets in general, I mean, I hope my favorite poets anyway, they really are trusting us as readers. Like, I don't want my hand held through meaning. I want to discover the meaning on my own terms as a reader. That's something I certainly expect of my readers of adult poetry. And you're right, like the insight that I've gotten from children is only that they're also capable of that kind of meaning, finding meaning on their own. So, yeah, I totally that. Although with children, like the only thing that I'm catching myself is like this word is complicated, but I think it comes across in the same direction, like I'm trying to think of another picture book that I wrote that came out last year. It's called The River is My Ocean. And it's not a hand holding kind of a book. It's really like you just feel it on your own. And I've seen children capable of experiencing that feeling. My daughter calls it a connection. She's like, I have a connection to that. I think it's like a term that she's learned in school, but I'm always thinking about that, like connections that readers can make on their own without my help. And it's our job, I think, as poets or writers to just put our voice forward and then trust that other folks can do that. But yeah.
That's beautiful. In closing, I just want to go back to the process thing in a little bit more detail because it's one of those things that I love when authors or anybody who does creative work, they pull back the curtain in the specifics and the logistics of what they do.
Yeah.
I was once interviewing a futurist who was talking a lot about the work that he's doing and, trying to find signals for what's happening for the future of journalism. And I said, like, what is a space that you research for signals that maybe is not obvious to folks? And he talked about patents. And I was like, oh my gosh, of course. Yes, we can be, Google has a patent database you can
Yeah.
go to. And it's changed my practice a little bit where I'll just kind of see like, is there a patent for this? Like, what's going on with this?
Yeah.
So can you share maybe just like one or two details about how you approach doing the work of being a poet?
Yeah. Well, you could talk about it for children's writing for sure. Sometimes I'll have a project that's put in front of me, like this is the project, this is like for ABCs of Black History, it was an invitation from my editor at the time to write about Black history, and so that was what I was setting forth to do. But oftentimes I'll just have an idea and I'll sit down and I'll write a first draft, then I'll send it. I don't know how in the weeds you want to get, but I'll write a first draft. I'll usually send it to my friends who are also writers and they will peer edit it, like get their thoughts first, or my partner will look at it and I'll get those thoughts and I'll gather them together, and if I feel strongly about it, I'll give myself a week to sit with a draft, and then I'll send it to my in my case I send it to my agent, and if she likes it then she'll send it out into the world. And I don't know if
Yeah,
this
yeah,
is what
yeah.
you're
No, like literally like the details because I think sometimes people
okay.
are like, "Oh, Rio, is a writer, like Rio just sits down at the computer and it all comes out done," you know?
Yeah. Yeah, it's mostly just like getting a lot of people's thoughts. I feel like it's helpful to have a writing community. Sometimes I've written things and not sent it out for peer review, but I always like to send it to some I have my best reader is somebody I know who works in nonprofit housing advocacy. It's like not at all related to the work I'm doing as a writer. So it doesn't have to be that you surround yourselves with writers, but just somebody that you end up like kind of trusting to give you like a nod. I sometimes just need that like little affirmation that yeah, this was good. I liked this. But yeah, then I'll send it out, and then an editor will introduce the ideas for an illustrator. That's out of my hands, really. That's all part of like the editor's role. I can also sometimes I'll give people illustrators that I really love to an editor, and they'll take them under advisement. But it's really their vision, like the part of their work to put together a voice and a style. And then sometimes I've worked throughout the entire course and publication of a book over years and never met or spoken to the person illustrating the book. It's like the most bizarre experience in a way. But yeah, Lauren and I are different. We have done two books together and we communicate more regularly. But I've had other books where I've never met or spoken to the person drawing the pictures, and I don't know. I feel like this is not. Maybe this is what you're asking. But yeah, that's basically how it goes. I write a draft. I ask for help from my friends. I send it to my agent. She sends it out. If an editor is interested, they buy the text, and we work together going forward on the illustration and the collaboration there.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I'm asking for because I love underscoring like it's a collaboration, right? I think that
Yeah.
other myth of creative work that it's like a lone wolf is kind of harmful, especially to
Yeah.
students and young folks. You
Yes.
had mentioned earlier, you know, the work of a poet looking for the horse or the connection, and sometimes that idea in early forms comes to you, or according to Liz Gilbert, like it's out of nowhere, right? Um,
Mhm.
do you find that those initial sparks or like a clue that an idea is coming, is that any time of the day? Like, what do you physically have on you, on your person, or in your home to make sure that those ideas aren't? Because it's happened
You
to me
catch
like a few times where I'm like, okay, I want to remember to do this. And I'm like, should I write it down? I do have a notebook on my bedside table. And I'm like, I'm too tired. I'll
right.
remember. And then I don't.
I know. I will say this is my advice. You always think you'll remember, and you probably won't. So I've had that experience a lot myself where I'm like, I'm gonna do this later. I'm gonna think about this later. And then I'm like, oh, I wish I had like, but also it's just like a nice little personal archive for yourself. If you write these ideas, even if you don't end up pursuing them, I think knowing what was catching your interest and what was inspiring you, like having a record of that is really valuable. I have words that I keep on my phone in a notes app. It's like totally not a romantic way to write, is like through technology, but it's true. And I just put words that just catch my attention. This is mostly for my writing for adults, but I'll go back and I'll just look at this list of words and marvel just like at language, period, because collectively they end up, as they accumulate into something too, it's like insight about yourself. Or so yeah, I would, notes app is great. You could send yourself an email or voice memo, or a notebook at your bedside is also really wise. But sometimes it'll also be for kids writing like play. I was watching my daughter play with a friend, and her friend is really interested in public transit. He's 4. He's really interested in buses, trains. He knows like the New York City Metro by heart.
Wow.
Kind of incredible. And she's really interested in like unicorns. And so together they were like playing a game that merged their imaginative interest, and it was like a unicorn on the M12 bus or something like that. And he was like, I'm the M12 bus, and she's like, I'm the unicorn. And we're that was like, that's the sort of thing that I'll write down. Not that I will like necessarily write that book, but just, a unicorn on the M12 is just something that's delightful to encounter later in life too. So yeah, I highly encourage you to write it down, even if you think it won't have a utility necessarily in the way you think it will.
Rio, I love that. And I love that idea of like, what a great writing activity for anybody who's a part of a writer's community, just to try and merge those two things. Cause I'm thinking, even like, is the unicorn the bus that in New York City is always on time? Like, there's just this one bus that nobody knows about, but it is always on time.
Right. Is that what it is? Yeah.
That's really beautiful. Thank you so much for that. Your phone notes app is probably a much more beautiful space than anyone else's. So thank you for sharing that. In closing, is this the end to the ABC's work, or can readers maybe look forward to? I'm thinking it's not the end, but what do I know?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. For us, the publisher has a series. They actually had a book that was written by Seema Yasmin, ABCs of Queer History. So it's not always the same contributors. And so I'm sure that they intend to move forward with more histories. But for now, I think Lauren and I are on women's history. We both have other picture book projects. Lauren is illustrating this really cool edition of The Night Before Christmas that's out this fall, that like features a Black family for the first time, which is kind of exciting. And I have a book that's out this fall called The Blue Velvet Chair, which is all about a chair in our apartment. So, but I think there's probably more really cool. I mean, I'm certain there are more really cool histories. I'm personally hoping that they do like an ABCs of protest history. I think that would be really cool. I don't know who would write it yet, but I think there's a lot more to explore there.
Oh, I love that. I said it was the last question and I lied. Rio, for anybody who's listening and they're thinking, we'd love to have you do a guest talk at our school, at our learning organization, what's the best way to investigate bringing you in?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I can be contacted at riocortez.com. Is the best
All
place.
right, wonderful. Thank you so much. Best of luck with the rest of the book tour, and we look forward to the Blue Velvet Chair.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tricia.